Wired Humanities Projects, which is located here in the Knight Library, as I see many library people here, so you know that. I'm very happy to welcome you to this exciting event, which is part of a series of activities related to a library committee charged with planning a digital scholarship center. And I'd like to take this moment to recognize the core group in planning this center: Karen Estlin, Kirsten Hirschholder, Leslie Larson, Kira Homo, John Russell, and Dave Baker. There are others contributing, but that's sort of the core group who comes to most of the meetings. I'd also like to thank the library and Dean Deb Carver for supporting this visit, and to recognize the interest and the generosity of the Oregon Humanities Center for their contribution in making this talk possible today. It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Julia Flanders. She was here 6.5 years ago to give a presentation in this very room, and we enjoyed it so much, and the field has continued to evolve in ways that we thought it would be great to invite her back. And I can think of no one else who represents the field of digital humanities better than Julia. She's the director of the Women Writers Project at Brown University, which is one of the earliest and quintessential digital humanities projects worldwide, and very impressive. Her doctorate is in English from Brown, and she had as the focus of her research digital humanities and the politics of scholarly work, which we'll enter into today's presentation, I'm sure. She's the immediate past president of the Association for Computers in the Humanities, which is one of the founding organizations behind the annual International Digital Humanities Conferences. Used to be called ACHALLC and so on, a real mouthful. Now it's Digital Humanities, which is very catchy and simple. Julia is editor-in-chief of the Digital Humanities Quarterly, which is an open access, peer-reviewed journal covering all aspects of digital media in the humanities. She serves on the board of directors of the Text Encoding Initiative. When I think of TEI, I immediately think of Julia and her team. For someone so accomplished, it's also a pleasure to be able to report that she is a gardener and a fiber artist, and so it was really a treat to have her here in Eugene with spring in full bloom, great weather, and to show her some of the gardens around town, and also to take her to the Soft Horizons fiber shop, which she remembered from her last visit. So we've had a great time already, and I hope you'll enjoy this presentation. Without further ado, I'd like to have her come up to speak with us about making digital humanities count. Julia.
With women's clothes is that they're not really designed to attach things to, so I apologize. Stephanie, thank you very, very much for that really kind introduction, and thank you all for coming, and thanks very much to the University of Oregon and all the groups that participated in making this visit possible. It's been an extraordinary pleasure, and I look forward to the sequel and in learning more about how you take this initiative. My mandate today might be captured in this sort of rough concept map. What I'd like to do here is first talk just a bit about history and about the evolution of digital humanities, both the term and the domain, and also about its institutional positioning, and consider how this history contributes to our sense of what counts. I think I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Is that true? Should I take off this other mic? What do you think? Videographer? No, it's okay? All right. So I'm interested in history. I'm interested in the history of the field and the term, and how our understanding of what counts is inflected by that history. And I'd also like to consider some examples of digital humanities work that is counted in various ways, and think about what these examples can tell us about digital humanities work and how digital humanities scholarship is evaluated and by whom. And I'd like to end by considering the role of libraries, which I think is really the key topic on the table here, and what libraries can do to foster productive scholarship and productive discussions about these issues, and also to encourage digital humanities scholarship that does and that should count. So just to give you a little bit of background on me and the perspective I bring to these questions, as Stephanie indicated, I'm trained as a humanist and I have a PhD in English, so I have a certain kind of acculturation in the sort of the anxieties of scholarship, I guess. And I've worked for my entire professional life since about 1993 in and with digital humanities projects as that concept has emerged and evolved. And I have, as she indicated, a particularly long connection with the Women Writers Project, which is a digital research and publication project that focuses on early modern women's writing. But also, I've worked as part of Brown's Scholarly Technology Group and more recently as part of Brown's Center for Digital Scholarship, and have been involved in an advisory or consulting role with a number of other digital humanities projects at Brown and at other institutions. So I feel as though, in a way, I've had a kind of spectator or voyeuristic or sort of vicarious relationship with lots of different kinds of digital humanities projects in a way that's really been a lucky and an exciting thing for me. Those projects have been situated in academic departments, in technology service units, and also in libraries. And in fact, the Women Writers Project itself has been in all of those different institutional locations during its lifetime, with interesting results in each place, right? I think that location does matter in terms of how we understand what counts as work, all of that kind of stuff. So it's worth observing at the outset that digital humanities has only very recently begun to be acknowledged as humanistic by the humanities themselves. And one symptom of this acknowledgement is the sudden, recent, dramatic upturn in digital humanities work, visible, for example, at the MLA conference, which is sort of like the Dow Jones of the academic stock market. And another indicator is the sudden, recent, dramatic upturn in the number of humanities faculty positions that include digital humanities in the job description or the title. And this has been quite notable for those of you who watch the job market, and particularly any of you who are humanities graduate students. I think it's really quite striking how digital humanities has become kind of almost part of a laundry list of competencies that new hires may be expected to demonstrate. All of a sudden, digital humanities is being practiced within humanities departments. And this doesn't mean that it is now only being practiced there. On the contrary, a very, very substantial proportion of the digital humanities work that's represented at the annual Digital Humanities Conference is being done by people who work in libraries or in IT groups or in instructional technology groups or in interdisciplinary centers. So it's been naturalized, in short, in many, many places across the academic institution. What we now call digital humanities was not formerly natural anywhere, however. On the contrary, it was profoundly interstitial, profoundly dialogic, critical, oppositional. In a sense, a community of people doing work that was seen as inappropriate or inexplicable to people around them. People doing work in organizations that were ad hoc, experimental, cobbled together, located in odd space remnants carved out of other jobs. And if this sounds familiar, it's because that situation in many ways hasn't changed a lot. I noted in the ACRL spec kit on digital humanities that many of the respondents to their survey indicated that having that same sense of being in provisional, contingent, not exactly accidental places, but places that were not the result of a settled intention, but rather had evolved over time or had been kind of assembled by some process. The earlier terms by which the field was named, humanities computing, humanities informatics, and similar terms, mirror the same sense of oddity, of dissimilar things yoked together, of practices that have been relocated onto a new terrain. And early definitions of the field, or early attempts to define the field, point to the same sort of quasi-oxymoronic quality of this label. For example, Willard McCarty notes this in his book titled Humanities Computing, and talks about the inherent improbability of the combination of these two things. When the newer term, digital humanities, first came into use roughly 2004, 2005, the inclusiveness that it projects was still only aspirational. There was a desire to make the term feel very welcoming, very embracing, not to make too fine a distinction between what was and what was not in the digital humanities. And the field at that time could still be understood, I think, without too much debate, as Willard McCarty understood humanities computing in his book, as being about questions of method, and above all, about the question, what is it about computational method that problematizes what we do? Like humanities computing, the two parts of the term digital humanities problematize each other with equal emphasis in both directions. Digital humanities gives us the sense of re-examining humanities methods from a different perspective, of putting a kind of media-specific pressure on the humanities, while at the same time, we also speak of digital humanities marking the distinctiveness of the needs of the humanities within the realm of digital analysis and digital media. Now that the phrase is in such wide use, I think some of that interior dialogue, that sense of mutual interrogation has receded a bit from the surface. And it's acquired a much broader range of application in two very interesting directions. First of all, the term digital humanities is often used to refer fairly broadly to an analysis of digital culture, to look, for example, at the impact of the digital upon modes of representation, modes of communication, modes of pedagogy and scholarship, things of that nature. And in an even broader sense, digital humanities is also frequently used to mean something akin to humanities done digitally. So a set of tools and competencies rather than a set of research questions. And this is something that we talked about a bit this afternoon in a smaller group. And as a result, the term almost denotes, in that sense, a set of support requirements rather than a set of disciplinary boundaries. So hence, when the larger institutional apparatus wants to support it, wants to support this set of undertakings, for instance, by creating a center, it makes a certain amount of sense to take an even more generalizing step and say that what we really want to support is not digital humanities, but digital scholarship, right? Why would we exclude anybody? Why not include the sciences? Why not include the social sciences? Thereby making a much broader gesture of inclusion. It may look as if the move from digital humanities to digital scholarship follows a very natural developmental logic. As the domain of the digital extends more and more broadly, so it's natural to anticipate and accommodate that breadth in our institutional structures as well. This seems like a generous and natural thing to do. But I think here it is fruitful to pause and ask, if so, if that is natural, why is it chiefly within the humanities that the digital, the concept of the digital, creates a scandal precisely about what counts? Within the sciences, digital research and publishing methods have not really seemed controversial at all. In fact, they've been, I think, purely enabling. Scientists are on board with the idea of preprints and offprints and data sharing and all this other kind of stuff. It's great. Their controversies, I think, have centered more on practical problems like open access, data curation, things like that. But in the humanities, the problem of how to assess digital scholarship, and digital humanities scholarship in particular, has prompted huge debate and, in a sense, a wholesale re-examination of basic processes like peer review. The reason for this, I think, lies above all in the fact that the digital humanities has a different relationship to its own methods from that of digital scholarship more broadly. Digital scholarship in the sciences is certainly transformative, right? There's no question about that. Digital methods have revolutionized scientific practice, but in ways that I think have to do more with speed and efficiency and capacity and scale, and don't seem necessarily like a paradigm shift in that sense. Our eSciences librarian at Brown says that to her science faculty, the term digital scholarship just seems baffling. It seems to mean nothing at all, precisely because for them, as she reports it, scholarship is all digitally inflected now in ways that seem perfectly unremarkable. It's a better tool, And they're used to having better tools. It happens to them all the time. So, you know, it's unremarkable. In the humanities, on the other hand, the introduction of the digital dimension reactivates a whole set of questions and anxieties that have been in play in various forms for hundreds of years. For example, what is the relation between medium and meaning? Are the instruments and infrastructural systems by which we create intellectual artifacts important or unimportant? How much should a gentleman or a scholar really know about the engine in the car he drives, or the editorial work that produced the book he reads, or the printing press that printed it, or the data model underlying the research tools he uses, or the digital infrastructure through which they're published? What's the status of such knowledge? Is building stuff cool or déclassé? What's the status of quantitative thinking for literary scholars? And most importantly, what are the stakes professionally of being on the wrong side of these questions? These questions are the boundary disputes through which the humanities builds and caresses and gnaws at its own edges. And the question of what counts in the context of digital humanities scholarship is thus not a simple question about whether and how a digital output of humanities scholarship can be understood as scholarship, or about whether there can be a field or a discipline called digital humanities, but a much more complex question that has to engage a whole history of the problem of what humanities scholarship is at all. And I have to digress here briefly to tease out some of the complexity of this question without really doing it justice, because I think it's a really huge and interesting problem. When we speak of making digital humanities count, there are really at least three ways to understand digital humanities here. We can understand it as meaning digital humanities projects, so humanities scholarship in digital form. In other words, the new and challenging forms of scholarship that are data-driven and that require a whole suite of new technical skills and collaborative project development and special funding, so things like the Women Writers Project. And this is the sense in which I'm chiefly using the term in what follows and in the examples that we'll be looking at in a moment. And the question of how this kind of work counts is very, very thorny and very interesting. But we can also understand digital humanities as meaning scholarship about digital matters, right? Scholarship that engages with the question of the digital, including scholarship that may be quite traditional in its form, so monographs, articles, things that we sort of understand their breed and how to consume them, but whose topical focus has to do with digital methods, digitally inflected culture, and so forth. And here, the research outputs themselves are recognizable as traditional scholarly forms, but they raise challenges concerning the expertise required for evaluation. So, how do we identify the appropriate peer community for such work? Can mainstream humanities journals find competent reviewers? Can departments find competent evaluators for their tenure and promotion cases? And this becomes another boundary dispute, right? A question of what properly belongs to the domain, what properly belongs in and out. This in turn becomes a question about discipline, and specifically about whether digital humanities can or should count as a discipline or field. And this seems to me to be the most consequential question of all, since the answer would have a direct effect on the question of where in the institution it should be pursued and by whom. And also, of course, what kind of training and credentials those people ought to have. And it returns us to the question of humanities scholarship more generally and its crisis of identity. Is digital humanities to join with the other humanities disciplines and adopt their somewhat instrumental view of technology? Can digital humanities help shift the humanistic frame of reference towards a more comfortable relationship with praxis? So returning now from my digression, how then does digital humanities count? I'd like to offer two sample perspectives on this question from quite different angles. The first is from the perspective of the scholar, framing the question as, what is scholarship? Mills Kelly wrote a series of blog postings in 2008 on making digital scholarship count, which make very, very interesting reading. They're very thoughtful. And he argued for a strict definition of digital scholarship, by which he meant digital work that counts. And he made a particular point of noting that digitization projects like Perseus or the Valley of the Shadow should not be considered scholarship. In other words, should not count. And as he put it, quoting Kathy Davidson, the database is not the scholarship. And he elaborated, neither of these projects, neither project offers an argument, neither advances our understanding of particular historical questions. And I think this line of argument raises in acute form the question of where arguments lie in digital scholarship. What if they reside, for example, in the data model? Which brings us back to one of the questions from a moment ago. How much should a gentleman or a scholar know about data models and where they live? Is that a stratum that constitutes a legitimate domain of expertise for a humanist? Can we make arguments with data models? And if we do, can we expect our colleagues to be able to understand those arguments? The second example is from an institutional perspective, and here the question is framed as, how do we evaluate scholarship? Or more expansively, what are the formal properties of things that count? How do we know that something has counted? The MLA Committee on Information Technology, which is a really industrious and useful committee, I have to say, has sponsored a number of workshops on evaluating digital work for tenure and has published guidelines, both formally and informally. And their very substantive short guide to evaluation of digital work was prepared by digital humanists and gives a checklist of points to look for and questions to ask, including things like adherence to relevant standards, data quality, quality of technical design and interface design, the profile of the online publisher, the degree of interconnectedness with other scholarship, and all sorts of things like this. So I'll show you the questions to ask, the questions that they recommend asking about a digital work to discover, how one might evaluate it. And then they also have a set of, in effect, questions to ask about best practices for digital work. And I think these make really interesting reading. They're very detailed, very substantive, and they really get to the point of what, from the point of view of an institution like the MLA, counts as work that has a certain kind of profile. And in a similar vein, the Center for Digital Research in the Humanities at University of Nebraska-Lincoln has developed guidelines for promotion and tenure criteria for assessing digital research in the humanities, which I won't quote from, which is substantively the same. And it lists a number of points of assessment, including competitive success in funding proposals, uniqueness and originality, connectedness, use of standards, involvement of relevant experts, et cetera. So very similar to this. And other institutions, I'm sure, have been putting together similar kinds of documents for internal use. The difference between these two perspectives is very instructive, I think. The two sets of public guidelines, the MLAs and the one from CDRH, are aimed at describing implementable policies and practices and systems. They say, in effect, the same qualities of originality, impact, excellence, and reputable peer review still apply, but we may need to look in new places for evidence of these things. They say, in effect, here is how we can discover when something has counted. In other words, they broaden our view of where to look for evidence of counting. For example, the peer review that's involved in grant proposals. The series of blog postings, on the other hand, is aimed at articulating the boundaries of a genre, scholarship. And it says, in effect, here is what we ought to value and why. In a sense, it's arguing that things are at risk for counting that ought not to count. It's in effect a kind of defensive argument. For purposes of our discussion today, I think I'd like to distinguish between three kinds of counting. First of all, the property of being quantifiably valuable towards tenure and promotion, or some similar reward exercises, such as the research assessment exercise in the United Kingdom. This is a form of credit. This kind of counting is a form of credit that operates within the very specific domain of the professoriate. It has a quite finely honed scope of applicability. Secondly, we might say there's a kind of counting that is the property of having a more general professional impact. For example, raising someone's visibility. And I deliberately, I have written here raising a scholar's visibility, but I think I don't want to even lean on the word scholar. I want to say any, whatever that word means, let's broaden it out. You know, any practitioner, any participants, raising their visibility and their their profile of professional expertise and respect among peers competent to judge. And this may also, this kind of counting, may also produce intangible, or at least less tangible, professional benefits, such as receiving awards, being invited to speak, having a large number of graduate students, being more widely cited. In other words, there's a kind of rippling effect that we can speak of that is less directly consequential than tenure, promotion, but nonetheless carries with it a certain sense of significance. And these kinds of credit affect people in faculty positions, but also people in library or IT or other kinds of staff positions. Now there's a kind of a more expansive definition. However, counting also happens very commonly for projects more than for individuals, or it happens for individuals because of their association with a project rather than for work that's recognized as belonging to them alone. And here I think we need to think as well about a third kind of counting, which involves the visibility and the impact of a project or tool with which everyone in the community is familiar and which everyone regards as a model. And this visibility may carry over to some extent to the individuals involved. So for example, the TEI, the Text Encoding Initiative, unquestionably counts, and anyone who has had a visible position of leadership within it, chair of the council, editor, workgroup leader, contributor of excellent examples, translator, and so forth, receives a certain kind of community respect just on that account from peers competent to judge, and probably also receives some of these sort of intangible benefits. But there's you can't sort of attribute the TEI to a person or even to a short list of persons. It's really more, a kind of a real corporate entity in some sense. And there's been quite a bit of recent discussion about proper forms of credit and acknowledgement that would do justice to the ways that digital humanities projects, large like the TEI, but also even small projects, typically are developed by teams whose members may come from very different institutional settings with very different reward and credit structures. And I think that in fact that it's precisely that institutional difference that really motivates our thinking about what counts, right? Because it's very important that we can provide the kinds of credit and acknowledgement that will in fact be meaningful within the reward systems that operate at different places in the institution. In practice, of course, it's these last two types of counting, the sort of the intangible respect from peers competent to judge and the kind of corporate aggregate counting that are easiest to discover from the outside. So without access to tenure files, it's hard to point to specific cases where a digital project has been counted towards tenure, although I think this does happen more and more, and one hears about it anecdotally from the people who have benefited from it, or from the people who have been specifically told, your digital project will not count for tenure. But I think that evidence is still quite anecdotal. So more specifically, what kinds of projects and publications and other forms of digital scholarship are we talking about here? I'm gonna now just offer a few examples with the caveat in advance that they're taken from the areas of digital humanities that I am most familiar with, which is a fairly narrow sector. So this is not a representative sample by any means, and if there are projects that you'd like to nominate in the discussion, I think it would be very interesting to kind of see what this group yields in terms of projects that seem to count. I do, though, think that these illustrate several different forms of impact, different ways of counting, and I'll sort of say a little bit about each one as we go. So the first category I'd like to nominate, I would put under the rubric of obvious scholarship, obvious scholarliness. These are projects that count because of their detailed engagement with data, in other words, their scholarly attentiveness to all of the components of the system, to the content, to the interface, to the metadata, to the, everything about the way the project is put together as data clearly matters and has been attended to in a spirit of mattering. They also are characterized by a kind of detailed engagement with the problems of method and digital method at a level of detail that's remarkable. And of course, they also exhibit a high degree of accuracy and just overall scholarly attention to detail. And the three examples that came to mind when I was sort of thinking, how is this group populated, were these three here: the Differences Slavery Made, the Walt Whitman Archive, and the Melville Electronic Library. And I don't know if you're familiar with all of these. The Differences Slavery Made is, in effect, a kind of monograph, or I guess a kind of hybrid historical monograph that also contains within itself the data, the historical data from which the argument in the monograph was derived. And the interface allows the reader to both consume the argument that is conducted in the monograph while also having access to the substantiating evidence that grounds that argument. And so it puts the reader into a kind of critical dialogue with the authors and with the evidence. It's an approach and a genre that is both deeply transparent because it's laying bare all of its presuppositions and so forth, while also permitting the articulation of a scholarly argument. So I think this is one that even Mills Kelly would accept as obvious scholarship. The Walt Whitman Archive is I'm sure you must all be familiar with it. It's a very substantial archive of Walt Whitman's works, I think with the ambition of being comprehensive. And here I think the scholarliness resides to a large extent in the care with which the data has been modeled. The materials are all transcribed and encoded in TEI using the Text Encoding Initiative guidelines. And the level of detail at which the metadata and also the representations of the documents themselves has been done is remarkable. And it's not only remarkable for the level of care and accuracy and thoughtfulness with which that markup has been applied, but also the amount of documentation and transparency about method that is available on the site as well. So here again, there's a sense in which the reader can engage with the assumptions that have gone into shaping the resource. And in addition to the aggregation of sort of primary source content, there's also a tremendous amount of sort of I don't even want to say auxiliary scholarship, but material accruing, let's say, pedagogical materials, scholarly materials, and so forth. So the whole thing just hangs together in a very amazing way. The Melville Electronic Library is still, I think, in the process of being developed, but this is something more of the genre of a scholarly edition. And it, too, has its data represented in TEI. It's an attempt to represent the manuscripts of Melville's works in a way that will show and demonstrate the revision process by which he composed his novels. And here again, the level of thoughtfulness and rigor with which that data modeling is happening is remarkable, and I think is sort of an ongoing effort. I know that John Bryant, who's one of the principals in the project, is a regular contributor to discussions on the TEI discussion list about how to represent these details, these incredibly thorny details of manuscript physicality and revision and meaning and all the rest of it. And it's infused with editorial theory, and there's something extraordinarily substantive about it. So these are, I think, represent a range of different ways in which one might say digital scholarship can count as obviously scholarly. I'm sure that if we spent another 20 minutes brainstorming, we could come up with as many others. The next kind of overview category of scholarship that counts that I thought of was sort of the pioneers, projects that have had a huge impact by being the first to demonstrate a paradigm-breaking new way of thinking or of doing things. And the examples that immediately came to mind were, first of all, the Canterbury Tales Project, which is a very, very early project from the dawn of, well, not quite the dawn, but the late morning of the digital humanities, its ambition was to digitize all of the manuscripts of all of the Canterbury Tales. And not just to digitize them, but then to represent them in a way that aligned all of the different versions so that you could compare all the witnesses. In a sense, it was like, instead of producing an edition of the Canterbury Tales, it was producing for the reader a full set of information you would need to create an edition of the Canterbury Tales. And again, the labor, the care, et cetera, is all there, but the vision of what an online edition could look like if every extant witness was digitized, and not just photographed, but transcribed and aligned, was truly groundbreaking at the time. I mean, it made the top of your head come off. It was truly, truly remarkable. Unfortunately, for various reasons, the project hasn't been completed, and so it stands as a kind of early proof of concept more than as a resolved achievement, if you like. But I think it was profoundly influential in creating a sense of what a digital edition could be like. Transcribe Bentham, I feel a little more hesitant about, only because this is a domain of digital scholarship that I'm much less familiar with, a sort of crowdsourced work. But I think it's, in my universe anyway, it's so significant for having demonstrated how a kind of intellectually responsible, rigorous crowdsourcing could work, right? They aren't just saying, hey, show up and try to transcribe a little Bentham. They give you these incredibly difficult manuscripts, and they give you an incredibly rigorous way of transcribing them. They don't say, in a kind of comforting way, oh, whatever you do is fine. They say, this is how you should do it, and we know you can, right? We're holding you to this standard. We expect quality from our crowd. And I think that too has had an effect of raising the bar, showing what's possible, something like that. I think of that as a pioneering project. The third category here is what I'm calling these foundational works. And these are really projects that are notable for establishing infrastructure, making possible the stuff that builds on them. And as much as anything, establishing a community of use, which is harder than you might think, right? I mean, it's not just about being appealing, it's about providing an intellectual apparatus and a set of questions that are compelling enough that lots of people will show up to participate in a responsible, rigorous way. And the projects that I've nominated here for this category, I think all sort of meet these criteria. Certainly the TEI, obviously I'm very fond of the TEI. I have a warm spot in my heart for the TEI, but it really is foundational, right? It is not just a standard that enables everybody to do their work, but it's an ongoing research investigation into the formation of that standard. And as such, it's kind of a hub through which lots and lots of work on how we model textual data is done every day. Omeka is an interesting case here because, again, I think it provides a basis for doing a whole genre of digital scholarship, which is quietly influential. You know, it fills a need that makes it possible for people to self-publish in a very interesting and quite powerful way, because it gives you a way of creating your own metadata categories, and it sort of encourages you to be rigorous with those categories. It establishes a habit of mind, perhaps, that I think is very interesting and fruitful. And the Canadian Century Research Infrastructure is a project with which I'm much less familiar, but it has been, I think, extraordinarily influential in, again, creating a kind of organizing infrastructure through which lots of other important scholarship can take place. So with those examples in mind, I think we can now shift our focus slightly and ask, what's the role of the library in these scenarios and in supporting the ecology within which projects like these are created and published and sustained? So first, let's think about the already established role and nature of the library. First of all, the library constitutes, in a way, a different view of scholarship. It's a view that represents the community rather than the individual, the consumer rather than the author, the past and the future, as well as the present. In other words, it brings other interests to bear on scholarship in a way that I think situates the library in a very different relationship. The library is also an entity that's responsible precisely for establishing and maintaining and enhancing the ecology of scholarship, not just an individual item taken by itself, but the discursive connections between different items in the scholarly universe. And also the library is an entity whose professional expertise has very much to do with system, right? With the ability to manage things at scale, to make things work. How about the newly emerging roles of libraries? If those are things we can agree the library has always done, what are the newly emerging roles? For one thing, libraries are a place where it feels natural to locate production processes, digital production processes, that need to operate at scale. Sorry, apparently I do something with my leg. It causes this to fall off. There we go. Processes that need to operate at scale with attention to consistency, quality, efficiency. So things like digitization and metadata creation and data curation all fall very naturally within the purview of the library for this reason. The library is good at it. Digital humanities projects often begin outside the library, but they often migrate into it precisely in search of the infrastructure and workflow support that the library can offer. And this is a natural evolution. Like the outside, the sort of the wilds are a place where things can crop up, but eventually when they want to live and survive over the long term, the library is a place where they can be at home. Libraries are also increasingly, I think, the brokers of connections to an interinstitutional ecology of standards, best practices, interaction with other information resources, linked data, metadata standards, all of that kind of thing. And there's there a point of professional contact through which the right kind of expertise can be channeled. And this provides another motive for digital humanities projects to find a home within the library ecology, although in a sense this is a benefit that extends even to projects that aren't directly within the library, right? The library provides that service for the institution as a whole. And the library is very often the place where that last larger scale project-based sense of counting and impact can take place because the library is positioned to develop infrastructure and tools and large-scale projects that have a much greater impact overall than projects by individual scholars framed around individual research questions. These roles, although I've named them as emerging, are also becoming recently traditional, if you like, in the sense that they're a familiar part of the new digital library landscape. How about more radical transformations? I had the fortune of talking to Jeffrey Schnapp, who came to Brown. He's the director of the Meta Lab at Harvard and has been thinking a lot about libraries and sort of the new and more sort of groundbreaking roles that they can play. And he describes a much more dramatically changed library. In his talk at Brown, he described a course that he taught at Harvard in the architecture department, I believe, which was called Bibliotheca, the Library Past, Present, and Future, which investigated the question, what form should the library of the 21st century assume? And he basically tasked his students with conceptualizing that as an architectural problem. And he is particularly interested, as he puts it, in the seam where the digital meets the physical. And he sees a kind of shifting balance between the traditional library functions that he describes in this beautiful way as storage and burial, sifting and activation. And he says that the storage and burial functions are basically receding in visibility, although not in importance, right? They're just moving off site. With the diminished emphasis on print resources that we're starting to see. And the animation and activation activities and functions are coming much more to the forefront. And so he foretells and advocates quite strongly a shift in the use of space away from storage and towards spaces of making and doing, spaces of sociality, spaces of display and communication. And in this context, I think we can see a very interesting role for both digital humanities projects and digital scholarship centers in the library. Digital humanities projects are, in a sense, the quintessential sites of making and doing in the modern academy. And one characteristic form of Digital Humanities Project, almost the archetype in a way, is in effect an activated archive, a digitized, reanimated representation of physical materials that were otherwise stored and buried, but are now seeing a second life of usage. And in the context of the social web, such projects are increasingly finding ways to connect their content with that of other projects. So they're forming these larger informational aggregations and are also able to invite contributed content from readers and to engage in what I've heard delightfully described as sociable publishing, right? Publishing that sort of anticipates this kind of interconnectedness and contribution via technologies of linked open data. Digital scholarship centers in the library are uniquely well positioned to foster these kinds of projects by providing access to the infrastructure that's necessary to achieve this kind of effective sociality, and also by brokering the diverse types of expertise that are necessary. So scholarship, information science, information technology, design, production, workflow management, all of that. And a library-based digital humanities center would also be well positioned as a space of sociality and engagement and display for the university and for the university's digital humanities work. In other words, the library is a reasonable place to expect that kind of serendipitous, fruitful engagement to take place. So how does the library contribute to the ways in which digital humanities and digital scholarship can count? So let's first of all just remind ourselves of the MLA's checklist, which on a second view, I think, looks like an inventory of things that libraries are good at. And this is a lightly edited version now, a reworked version of that list. We need things like expert knowledge of data standards and familiarity with work processes that are necessary to implement them. We need familiarity with robust, scalable delivery systems. We need familiarity with methods of data enrichment and annotation. And we need visibility as a primary access point and as an agent for the dissemination of scholarship. And all of these things seem to me to be things that the library already excels at. And we might add a few more points that aren't explicit in the MLA list, but that are sort of natural adjuncts to it. For one thing, authentication and accreditation in the absence of or in advance of peer review. So for example, the institutional repository. And finally, above all, I would include and emphasize data curation processes, including the methods by which digital scholarship can be kept in meaningful circulation, which is the huge problem that everybody is worried about. For humanities scholarship, which has such a comparatively long horizon of use, substantive reuse and long-term documentable impact are really the essence of what counts. Without that, there can be no counting at all. I'd like to close with just a few notes on some key activities that I think centers of digital humanities or of digital scholarship could fruitfully undertake to strengthen their position within this ecology, both within the institution and also as representatives of the institution in the international digital humanities world. First of all, I think they can create and maintain the infrastructure that scholars need to create digital humanities scholarship that counts. So with attention to the points noted on the MLA checklist. And that infrastructure is something that no individual scholar can create for him or herself. So creating that infrastructure, making it available is a crucial activity for any digital humanities center. Secondly, focus on programs as much as on projects. You can think of programs as almost being like the flywheel, the force of aggregation that puts projects into conversation with each other and keeps each one from being solely kind of one-off sui generis thing, right? Programs are our ability to stand above our projects and say, here's what they have in common, or here's a larger trend that we should be participating in, or here is some larger scale effort that all of these projects could be contributing to. Programs also help individual scholars direct their research towards some kind of larger goal. Third, build strong collaborative relationships between library staff and scholars that go beyond the ways that these two communities have traditionally worked together. And I would say, if possible, be also open to hiring some Digital Humanities Center staff who don't necessarily have a library background or don't have solely a library background. I think there are more and more of these sort of hybrid individuals entering the job market now that have a really interesting interstitial perspective to offer, both on the operations of the center and also on the needs of its faculty constituencies. Fourth, build programs that situate the center as a community hub. And I would look here to organizations like the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities as an example. Provide things like workshops and opportunities for discussion, reading groups, colloquia, exhibits, anything that kind of brings people in the door and gives them a sense of investment in what's happening. Fifth, if possible, involve graduate students and provide substantive work opportunities for them that bridge traditional scholarship, information science, and digital humanities. Because I think that synthesis is really where the field is headed. These are the digital humanities scholars of the future. And finally, just as some digital humanities centers give their staff a small fraction of time that's devoted to their own research, it would be really exciting if digital humanities centers dedicated a small fraction of time to community participation of some kind. And I'm thinking of things here like contributions to standards work or substantive participation in online forums, for example, reporting on work done or reporting on specific challenges that have been encountered, writing and sharing documentation for public use, preparing tools for wider dissemination. I think an investment of this kind would really pay for itself in the volume of the shared expertise that would come back, the public visibility, and also the collaborative opportunities that would yield. And with that, I will close, and I look forward very much to your questions. Thank you so much.
Transcribed and coded foundational work or scholarly work like the Walt Whitman collection or archive. Can you think of any examples that would be more of like, that was specifically created digitally? Let's say, you know, I could think of something unrelated like Wikipedia. Is there anything been done in a scholarly way that's just been solely yeah.
That's a really good question. I'm going to have to let my mind settle for a second and think about this. I would look, this is not exactly the genre that you're thinking about. I think that one place where people do work in that way is in what we might call sort of community self-help, community documentation, things like that. So I'm thinking of things like DH questions and answers, or the various wikis that support certain kinds of open source software development projects. In other words, places where what's being developed is a community expression of expertise. Now I'm trying to think of an example that would be more content-y, in other words, sort of primary source stuff that is born digital. But now I'm wondering, is that a real category? Can you give an example of? Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. How about that? Does that count?
Yeah, that would qualify. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's importantly a community source. Even though, I mean, it's invited and curated and so forth, but it seems to me that it certainly meets the quality of scholarliness that you're talking about, and it is, you know, it's generated for the occasion. It's not digitized from some other source. I don't know. Can other people think of examples that my mind is blank to at the moment? This is a really interesting question.
Well, things like the Hacking the Academy book,
Sure.
Or what is the journal on the Press Forward platform now?
Right. DH Now.
DH Now, which is in some ways a taking born digital text, mostly things like blog posts, and putting them through a peer review and revision process, and then republishing them, in a journal. And so it's kind of like, almost like a crowdsourced, in some ways almost like a crowdsourced journal. I think the curation or the editorial mechanism is also a bit more broadly crowdsourced. But I think that kind of, it's mostly, scholarly publications, born digital scholarly publication, rather than, I can't think of a good.
Those are great examples, and they also make me think of this one, the stuff that's done at Media Commons, but particularly the New Everyday, which is curated but also voluntaristic, I think. I mean, it's an example of scholarship that arises from the community in digital form and takes advantage of the digital form in some very interesting ways. But all the stuff at the Media Commons site is sort of in this mode, I think, and very interestingly so. Yeah.
It seems to me that our focus has been more on digital rather than on humanities. For me, as a PhD student of literature, I think about what makes what we do really humanistic. For example, the project we were talking about, the Whitman project, and I try to visualize the process in which the project materializes. So let's imagine a humanist who's expert in equipment and a computer scientist come together into a process where they make the project possible. So the problem of intellectual property rights arises here. So who is really the creator of this project, the computer scientist or the Whitman expert? And I would imagine what would make this project humanistic is simply because of the expertise from the Whitman expert, whereas the computer scientist simply offers the technical support out here. So as a collaborative project between a computer scientist, humanist, making this final product possible, who is actually the creator? Who is actually the intellectual property creator out here?
I think, in a sense, that question goes right to the heart of the question of what the digital humanities is, because, and I want to sort of back up a step and unpack the assumptions that go into it as well, because in a project like the Whitman Archive or the Women Writers Project or any of these other sort of digital projects, the process of collaboration and the process of project development isn't quite as starkly divided as you're suggesting. In reality, what happens is that let's say the scholars, the Whitman experts who have an interest in creating a digital edition or a digital archive or whatever, work with people who are not as different from them as you might think. In other words, they're not computer scientists typically. They'll be, humanists or digital humanists who are able to translate the sort of strictly humanistic questions that Whitman scholars, might bring to the table. For example, being interested in the revision, in Whitman's revision of his materials, or being interested in poetic genre and how form is represented in Whitman's verse, or who have content expertise, who are interested in the people who are named, the thematics of Whitman's poetry and so forth. That collaborative group is really working as, and I can't stress this enough, as in effect one brain whose interest is in how to represent these very humanistic ideas in a formal way, in an informational way, such that actually maybe I can even show an example, such that even in the interface and in all of the things that one wants to do with that data, one can then return that information back to the scholarly community in ways that are richer and more vibrant and more useful than they were. So for example, if we are looking at a poem here, this is the poem, as it comes to us from Whitman's hand. This is the result of that data modeling process through which the editorial team has basically read the manuscript, understood the manuscript, and also analyzed the set of editorial practices that are going to be brought to bear on the manuscript, and come up with a set of representational conventions and terminology and so forth that can be used to produce the underlying data, which then, when we want to visualize it, we can visualize in this way. But we could also imagine many, many other things that we could do with the fact that this data knows that this word was added and then deleted, or that this word was inserted at that point, that kind of thing. Now, the thing that's important about the way I'm stating this is that it's not that the Whitman scholars have their Whitman ideas and then the technical people have their technical ideas and they kind of go boink like that and this happens. It's much more a matter of translation back and forth. And I think, so my answer to your question would be, the intellectual responsibility is completely shared, because there is no clear point where I could separate out, the Whitman part from the technical part, right? It's one set of development activities. And I think that's the reason why there's so much emphasis now on ways of acknowledging the full teamness of digital humanities project work. But I think that there are certainly projects and individuals, it's very, very common, I think, among sort of the more traditional humanities, to think of what they would be doing if they had a digital project as, I have my scholarship, I will show up at the digital place, and then the digital people will make my scholarship digital. And that, if one brings that set of assumptions to it, then your question arises very, very logically. And in fact, the set of questions I introduced at the beginning, like how much does a gentleman have to know? How much does a scholar need to know? How much is scholarly to know about the technical stuff is exactly the question, right? And I think that there's certainly a strongly prevailing trend in the history of humanities scholarship that very much wants to distance itself from technological matters, just as it has distanced itself from the printing press, right? That's not my problem. And I think that in that case, if one is operating in that universe, then, in a sense, the technology is, the technology part doesn't have any more intellectual responsibility than the guy who typesets your book. And we've all agreed that the guy who typesets your book does not get credit on the title page. I really think that paradigm, that way of understanding the relationship is shifting. And I think that the sort of more tightly integrated model that I've described is much more prevalent nowadays. But I think it is a point of debate, and it's an excellent question. I mean, it's really the key question. So I hope that somewhat addresses what you have in your mind. Yes?
Going off of this Walt Whitman page here, on my iPhone and my iPad, I have Leaves of Grass. It's more of a commercial copy, not a scholarly copy. So how do you see this document being transcribed onto an iBook or an ebook in the same format you see it there? Because I'm guessing also that this is just online access as opposed to having this access offline.
You're right in the sense that at the moment I think the Whitman Archive doesn't provide a kind of a sort of offline downloadable version, although they perfectly well could. And I think your question about mobile devices and so forth is really interesting, because one of the points of value, one of the things that is notable about the approach that they've taken, right, representing the data in this, using a representational system like the TEI, like XML. And if it would be useful to see examples, I can show those. I don't know how much this audience knows about, like when I say TEI, do you picture what I'm picturing, or is it just an acronym? But the virtue of taking the approach that they've taken is that this particular view, this particular form of display, is only one of infinite possible ways of using that data. And certainly another way of using it is to generate a format that would be usable on a mobile device, like EPUB or HTML for mobile devices or whatever. In other words, what they've created, the data that's driving this site, is like it's like protoplasm. It's like a protein energy. It contains in it all the information needed to produce lots and lots of different representations. The fact that they haven't done that yet, I think, is just a matter of funding, time, priorities, and so forth. But certainly, plenty of digital projects of this kind have, versions of their site and versions of their data which not only, are tailored to look okay and look fine on a mobile device, but actually take advantage of things like locative technologies. So you could imagine, I'm just making this up, but the Encyclopedia of Chicago, when you view it on your mobile device, could know where you are, take you to the entry that talks about a place where you are in Chicago, give you historical photographs, all of that kind of stuff, because the data is so self-aware and so knowledgeable. So yeah, I think that in a way, this aspect of the digital humanities has been doing it right for a very long time, because even before there were mobile devices and even before there was a web, it was clear that producing data that represents, the core ideas, the ideas of revision and addition and poetry and so forth, that data would be always able to respond to whatever new technological opportunity came along. So when there are mobile devices, the data is ready for the mobile devices. When there's the web, the data is ready for the web. It was one of the great, profound, lucky insights, I think, the idea of that kind of data representation. So yeah, and I realize I'm speaking very abstractly, and if you'd like, I can show you an example of what I'm talking about. But I don't know if that's a good enough answer already to your question. Other questions? It's funny because I remember when I first began working at the Road Writers Project, it was 1992 or thereabouts, and the director, Alan Rainier, was still is a profound enthusiast of this kind of text markup. And we were grad students, we didn't know anything. There was no web, there was no, it was like we'd come from Mars. But he said, this approach to representing our data, this approach that basically says, this is a poem, here is a line. What the data is really saying to us is, this is a poem, this is a line of poem, this is an addition, this is a deletion, right? Instead of saying if we were speaking in HTML now, we would be saying, this is a paragraph with an indentation with a line through it, this is another paragraph with a line through it, this is a paragraph with a line through it, this is a superscripted thing, right? That way of speaking, that kind of data tells us nothing. We're saying, it's a poem, it has lines, it has additions, it's been revised. That knowledge, the fact that this data carries that knowledge in itself, is the key to then being able to do anything you want with the data. And Alan would, wave his hands in the air, he was so excited about it. And he would say, there will be a time when you can do, really wonderful, there will be tools, there will be software. And we're like, yeah, Alan, that's right, of course. And then the web came along, and he was right. There were tools, there was software, we could see it in blue. It was like, he was like a prophet. So anyway, there's my inspirational moment. Yes?
I wanted to ask, you were talking about collaboration and the problem of, the tension between hierarchies within the university and who gets, and I was wondering if in the natural sciences, these kinds of collaborations are more transparent than in the humanities, and how you would see them becoming more transparent in the humanities.
When you say transparent, do you mean, can you elaborate on that term a little bit?
I mean, just for the symposium we had about a month ago,
So this is kind of where my
Right, right, I see. You know, I don't have any first-hand knowledge about this. Certainly anecdotally, it's popularly supposed that in the sciences, the mechanisms for acknowledging other kinds of collaborative labor are better evolved than in the humanities. And certainly the sciences have much more robust conventions for, acknowledgement and, for listing authors, multiple authors, and there's a whole system for who gets to be first author and all that kind of thing. Honestly, though, I don't know whether the sciences do a great job, for example, of acknowledging, the lab staff and, the people who are the equivalent of the programmer. I have no knowledge of that at all. I think the digital humanities assumes that the sciences are good at that, but I think that's more of a sense of guilt and self-accusation than it is an actual knowledge about those fields. And in the digital humanities now, there has been, especially in the past few years, with the rise of these sort of debates about alternative careers in the academy and different kinds of para-academic roles, there's been a lot of attention paid to these questions, to forms of credit and ways of representing an entire team that are fair to the team and that acknowledge people's work in a way that rewards them and so forth. And there's a new initiative that's just getting started now called Fair Sight, which would attempt to come up with some kind of community standard or best practice for acknowledging labor. Because one of the challenges, of course, is if you're an author writing an article about a project, if you were citing a book or citing an article, there's a clear format for citation. You know whom to list as an author and so forth. But if you're citing a project, where do you find that information and how do you know whom to list? And you can't just list everybody on the credits page for the project because you'd have like 58 names. So Fair Sight is an attempt to foster a community discussion about that and to come up with some agreed upon way of being more transparent in ways that work for everybody, right? That aren't just a kind of an attempt through too much information to address this problem. But I've certainly heard often enough, there's now a kind of pro forma acknowledgement that says, here are the people, and thanks so much to our, in effect saying, and so who typed the manuscript, to my lovely graduate student who did the fact checking. And there's a funny sense in which it's clearly not a real acknowledgement, even though it's there. So I think there are attitudes as well as practices to be addressed. Yeah, you had another question.
Would you mind sharing your personal trajectory, how you got into this emerging field, and how your humanistic training played a role in doing this, and in return, how your humanistic understanding is enhanced by this whole enterprise, if you don't mind?
Yeah, sure. I entered the field by what can only be described as a lucky accident, because I was a graduate student and I received a summer funding, a summer proctorship. And the proctorship gets to choose where you go, where your job placement is. And I got placed with the Women Writers Project. And I had no idea what the Women Writers Project did or what I would be doing there. But the rest is history, as it were. I stayed. But the reason I stayed and the questions that I found compelling, and I think this addresses the other part of your question, had to do with representation, right? The task at hand was, here is a new representational language called TEI, and it professes to have, a vocabulary for describing primary source texts. How can we take that descriptive language and apply it rigorously and meaningfully to this body of early modern women's writing? And so that process required us to engage with editorial theory, an understanding of printing technologies and the sort of the visual rhetoric of early printed books, an engagement with issues of genre and the evolution of genre over time, and a whole set of questions for which I wouldn't call it expertise. I'm not an expert in those things, any of those things. But whatever knowledge I had was very germane because it enabled me to think meaningfully about how those questions, those methodological questions, translated into the problem at hand, namely creating this formal descriptive vocabulary. And I think that that interplay between the unrepresentable richness of real stuff, right, books, things, and the formal constraints of, information systems just fascinates me. And I think, in a way, in retrospect, looking back at the things I was interested in as an undergraduate and stuff, that was always interesting to me. I just didn't have a place to put that interest. And so this problem came along, and I recognized it instantly as the problem that was interesting. And I think really that's why humanists are so important to the digital humanities, because they bring the pressure, the problem, the challenge, right? If we didn't have humanities data, it would all be easy. It's easy to write data models. It's easy to formalize stuff that's just already formalized. The challenge comes when you have something that's messy. I mean, Stephanie was showing me today these amazing Arabic manuscripts that have writing on the diagonal and layers of stuff in different colors and things in spirals. And, that's what's really worth trying to represent. And, more power to you. But without that stuff, the data modelers get complacent, and they think that, data's a cinch, they're going to do it again. So, yeah, anyway, it's an interesting question. Thank you. Yeah.
I was wondering what your opinion is on copyright and how that might pose a challenge for open access to a lot of this information, and what you sort of see as the future of that.
Yeah, this is an area where I feel very grateful for other people's expertise and hard work and opinions. I mean, my personal feeling is that, well, I don't even know if I have a personal feeling about this. Certainly, you've named one of the great challenges, and in fact, we were talking at lunch about the difficulties that lie in wait for anybody who wants to work on modernist poetry or 20th century novels. I think the copyright question actually operates in a couple of different realms, and certainly the copyright problems surrounding the primary source content is well understood, and there's nothing we can do about that. I mean, unless we go and do a sit-in in Washington or something like that. But the question about the intellectual property or the copyright status of things like data models and text encoding systems and things like that, I think is quite interesting. And it's notable that within the digital humanities community, I think there's a universal sentiment in favor of open access for that kind of thing. I mean, open source, I guess, is the better, the more applicable term there. It's, I think, really notable and nice that nobody has argued or suggested that there's any benefit to anybody in the community in keeping that kind of thing restricted or private in any way. There's definitely a kind of a philosophy of sharing is such a Sesame Street kind of word, but really the sense that you cast your intellectual capital upon the waters and it comes washing back to you 1,000-fold. And I don't see that changing within the academy. I don't know. I wish I had. I think, to be perfectly frank, I think of copyright problems as just something that is so intractable and so broken and so messy and so not something I can fix that I just kind of go, ah! And again, thanks to the people who really have the kind of mind that can take a rigorous approach to it. So I'm sorry, I don't think I have a very good answer for you, but that's, in practice, that's how I've operated. And the projects that I work on have all thankfully been working on content that tends to be much older, so it hasn't been so much of an issue. I was, well, yeah, I'll leave it at